Hey guys, Josh from the Ancient History Guy here. Hello and welcome to all. I hope you are having a fantastic day. Anyways, today we are going to be talking about the ancient Persians, specifically the ancient Persian military. Now, I've done a whole series on the ancient Persian military units, which you can find in my historical warfare playlist, but there is a common theme that seems to consistently come up when discussing the ancient Persian military, which is, why didn't the Persian military evolve when they clearly had been defeated by the Greeks? Why didn't they add heavier armour? This often leads to a misrepresentation of later Persian armies, which are often portrayed, as the Roman Total War fans call them, pink pajama men. So, what did later Persian armies actually look like? Well, firstly, you must look at the logic behind why these so-called pajama military units wore the armour they did. You see, a lot of the Persian military was based on the terrain they were fighting on. Iran and much of the Middle East is actually fairly flat, and lends itself to mobile skirmish warfare. Mobile warfare needs speed, as the faster a combatant moves, the easier it will be for them to overcome their enemy. This led to many of the classical ancient Persian military units being very lightly armoured. Examples of this being the Sparabara, who only wore a padded vest as a form of protection. This is even further exemplified by the Takabara, who didn't even wear that. This allowed the Persians to carve out a massive empire in the east, where the terrain suited this mobile form of warfare. However, when the Persians were forced onto smaller battlefields, they found themselves unable to carry out the maneuvers that had won them their huge empire. This is perhaps best exemplified at the Battle of Thermopylae, where the narrow pass actually funneled the Persians into an incredibly narrowed space, thus meaning all of the Persian tactics were basically redundant, as they could not move. Ultimately, because they were fighting on smaller battlefields, and the fact that Greece's terrain doesn't really lend itself to mobile warfare, meant that the Persians were not only defeated, but driven out of Europe almost entirely. Now, the soldiers that fought in the Persian armies at this time were largely seen as the default Persian military, so much so that it's often wrongly lumped into the incorrect periods of history later on, thus leading to the misconception that the Persians never adapted their military to the changing military tactics of the time. The truth is actually the opposite. This is exemplified during a nasty civil war within the Persian Empire. Perhaps one of the most forgotten important people in history was the loser of this war, Cyrus the Younger. Cyrus is largely seen as one of the most beloved and trustworthy rulers of the Persian Empire, so much so that many of the rebellious Greek subjects actually willingly followed him into battle. Cyrus had a self-imposed personality trait of never telling a lie and always making good on deeds. This ties directly to Cyrus's own religion, Zoroastrianism, which views telling lies as one of the worst sins a man can make, as it encourages evil, and Zoroastrianism is all about defeating evil with good deeds. Xenophon, a Greek mercenary general serving under Cyrus, is noted as having said he would tell no lies to anyone. Thus, doubtless it was he won the confidence of individuals and of the communities entrusted to his care. Xenophon also goes on about how Cyrus was probably the most worthy of the title of kingship since Cyrus the Great. Sufficient to say, Cyrus the Younger was largely seen as a good guy. Cyrus wasn't just a good guy, he was also a military innovator. For one, he saw how outdated the idea of having light infantry was, and how the Greeks had completely stomped them during the Greco-Persian Wars. Cyrus decided that he would make the Greeks the core of his army, specifically the heavy hoplites, all while adding more armour to his Asarabari and native cavalry, essentially gradually developing some of the first armour cavalry in the ancient world. As he assembled his army to overthrow his brother, the Greeks made up a majority of his forces, with Xenophon's 10,000 heavy hoplites making up the bulk of the force. When the two forces met, the heavily armoured Greeks smashed through the Persian lines. However, Cyrus would not ask his men to go into battle without him, with him personally leaving his guard against his brother's guard. This resulted in Cyrus being killed by a stray javelin/dart. Sources are a bit vague as to what killed Cyrus. This led to the Greeks retreating from the battlefield. However, the mere usage of Greek hoplites in the battle by Cyrus set in motion a gradual increase in armour in ancient Persian armies. In fact, this use of hoplites by Persians against Persians didn't just end after Cyrus's death. In fact, throughout much of the later Persian Empire, Greek hoplites and even Greek commanders were regularly employed as mercenaries to supplement Persian armies. A noticeable example of this is Memnon of Rhodes, who at the Battle of the Granicus River deployed around 5,000 Greek hoplites against Alexander the Great. Arguably, these Greek mercenaries actually presented the most resistance to the conquering Macedonian king throughout much of his campaign, so much so that none of the 5,000 mercenaries survived the campaign. They had been simply too much of a thorn in the king's side. Indeed, by this time, even the cavalry had become a little bit more heavily armoured. Bactrian and Cappadocian cavalry, along with the famous Asarabari, had gradually lost their roles as skirmisher cavalry, largely due to the fact that their riders were adding more and more armour to both themselves and their horses. In fact, as Alexander himself was invading Persia, the heavily armoured Persian cavalry was largely recognised as the best heavy cavalry in the world at that point. It was only by mixing his own heavy cavalry, the Companions, with the lightly armoured Hypaspes infantry unit that Alexander was able to defeat this new heavy cavalry, with only minor losses to his own units. This was in stark contrast to his previous engagements with the Persian cavalry at Issus, where it had taken a considerable amount of effort and many dead Thessalonians to defeat them. Around this time, the Persians seem to have gone out their way to employ Greeks into their armies, despite their general mistrust of them. The heavy infantry was simply too good at their job. This demand for Greek hoplites eventually resulted in Persians creating their own versions, the Cardaces. The Cardaces were basically a Persian hoplite, using the same armour and tactics as their Greek counterpart. This unit was so successful that it actually survived the fall of the Persian Empire and became a valued asset to the later Seleucid Empire. So what do I think of this? Well, after reviewing the evidence, it's fairly apparent that the preconceived notion that all Persian armies were made up of pink pajama men is wrong. The truth is that the Persian army was constantly evolving, adapting to new circumstances and new methods of warfare. This evolution was hastened by Cyrus the Younger, who definitely seemed to have recognised the value of heavy infantry and cavalry, whilst also learning the lessons from the Persians' failed invasion of Greece. In fact, the Persians were so heavily armoured by the time Alexander invaded their empire that their cavalry was largely considered the best heavy cavalry in the world, also whilst their infantry was beginning to resemble Greek hoplites more and more. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you for watching and listening to our videos. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe if you've enjoyed. All sources are listed and linked in the description below. I've been the Ancient History Guy, and as always, I'll be seeing you later.